and welcome back to Contract B. This is the final video for Remedies, and we are just looking at remedies under the ACL. As I said at the very beginning of the first video for this week, much of this stuff will be review for you guys, particularly the stuff on unfair contract terms and consumer guarantees. Okay, here we are at section 23, which is the unfair terms provision. And as you'll recall from contract A, a term of a consumer contract or a small business contract, that provision came in just in November last year, is void if the term is unfair and the contract is a standard form contract. So that leads you to ask, what is an unfair term? So then we look down at section 24, and it generally means, things that are fairly lopsided in favour of one party. So it would cause a significant imbalance in the party's rights and obligations arising under the contract, not really necessary to protect the legitimate interests of the party who's going to be advantaged by the term, and it's going to cause detriment to the other party if it's relied on. Okay, let's have a look then at section 25, which gives us some examples of unfair terms. And you can see again, just from the repetition of text there, it's all about lopsidedness, where one party is really getting this enormous advantage and the other party is kind of, being terribly disadvantaged. So where one party can avoid or limit performance of the contract, they can basically do what they want. They can either perform, not perform, do as they please. Where one party can unilaterally terminate the contract, where a term penalises the other party for a breach. That word penalty should now be ringing bells since we've discussed damages in week 9. A term that permits one party to vary the terms of the contract. Banks love to do that, don't they? One party can just renew or not renew, and you can vary the upfront price payable. All sorts of other examples there of the kinds of terms that will be unfair. Now, in order to work out what the effect of an unfair term in a standard form contract is, we look at section 23 sub 2. The contract continues to bind the parties if it is capable of operating without the unfair term. So as it says in your study guide, if in fact a court can sever out that obnoxious unfair term, the contract can quite happily roll along as it was always intended to do. Problem is, if that unfair term is stuck like glue to the rest of the contract, then in fact the whole contract will likely be struck down. So they are your remedies for unfair contract terms. Pretty severe. Either the term's void or the whole contract's void. Okay, in terms of consumer guarantees, what happens when things go wrong there and a consumer guarantee is breached? First thing is you need to work out whether it's a major failure or a minor failure. If it's a major failure, it's going to comply with section 260. And sub A, it'll be a major failure if the goods wouldn't have been bought in the first place if you knew how bad the defect was going to be. No real surprises there. Or the goods depart in one or more significant respects if they were supplied by description from the description, if they were supplied by sample from the sample. And then if the goods are substantially unfit for their purpose, if they're unfit for a disclosed purpose, or they're not of an acceptable quality because they are unsafe. Any of those things are going to add up to a major failure. Yes? So then we skip back to section 259. Now, section 259 sub 3 is the major one that you want to go for. If the failure to comply is a major failure that we've just seen in section 260, then you can, here's the big one, notify the supplier that the consumer rejects the goods, and obviously you have to give them grounds for your rejection. If that fails and you actually want to keep the goods for some reason, you can actually take an action to recover compensation for reduced value of the goods because of the shoddy workmanship or whatever it is that's caused the problem. Okay, so what happens then if your failure of the consumer guarantee is not a major failure. Well, then we skip to section 259 sub 2, and under that provision you can require the supplier to remedy the failure within a reasonable time, or if the supplier refuses or fails to comply with that request, then you can go ahead and have the failure remedied by someone else, take action against the supplier, and get your costs of having the thing remedied by someone else paid by the supplier. Or you can, subject obviously to 262, notify the supplier that you reject the goods and the ground or grounds for your rejection. So if it's not a major failure, you have to go through this kind of circuitous route of asking the supplier to remedy whatever defect it is. If they don't do so, you can get it done by somebody else, or you can just go ahead and reject the thing. Now, if you don't get to reject the goods, how are you going to ask the supplier to remedy the problem? Well, you look at section 261, and under section 261 it tells you how suppliers can remedy. So if the defect relates to title, you can get them to cure the defect in title. If it doesn't, you can get them to simply repair the goods. You can get them to replace the goods, and you can get refunds. They are the kinds of remedies that you'll be seeking under 259(2). Other than that, if the supplier doesn't go ahead and remedy, as we said, you can reject. Or if it's a major failure, you can reject. In either case where you are entitled to reject, there is an exception in 262 that will knock you out there for your entitlement to reject. Obviously, it's just the common sense stuff. So if you've taken too long, the rejection period has ended, the goods have been lost, destroyed, or disposed of by the consumer, there's an issue of damage, or they've become attached to or incorporated in other real property. Common sense kinds of exceptions there. The rejection period is then discussed in 262 sub 2. So they are the remedies in relation to breaches of the consumer guarantees. So let's now skip back to our main slide here that we had before, and we're going to be looking at the main remedies that you can get for breach of things like section 18, which is our friendly, misleading or deceptive conduct provision. You can see here main remedies, section 232 injunctions, section 236 damages, section 237 compensation orders, and there's also some other kind of groovy non-punitive orders that we're going to have a little look at as well. So here we are at section 232 injunctions, something I prepared earlier, and you can see here a court can grant an injunction on terms it considers appropriate if it thinks that there's been a breach of chapter 2, and that is where section 18, misleading or deceptive conduct, lives in chapter 2. You can have an injunction granted against you if you have attempted to breach section 18. Also, you have all these lovely accessorial provisions. So if you've been rather naughty and you've done things like aiding, abetting, counselling, inducing, knowingly concerned in, conspiring to breach such a provision as section 18, then you may have an injunction granted against you. Note that the ACCC can apply for the injunction, or any other person. So if you've been on the receiving end of a breach of section 18, you can apply for an injunction as well. That is the main provision in relation to injunctions. Then if we skip down to section 236, we have our old friend provision for damages. So if a person suffers loss or damage because of the conduct of somebody else, and the conduct was a breach of chapter 2, so section 18, the claimant can recover the amount of the loss or damage by action against that other person or any other person involved, again bringing in that accessorial liability. Okay, so there's your basic damages provision there. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is section 237 compensation orders. So you can have a compensation order application made by the injured person who's suffered or likely to suffer loss or damage because of that breach of chapter 2, or on the application of the ACCC. What can the court order? Such order or orders as the court thinks fit against the person who engaged in the conduct. Now, Section 243 gives you an idea of the kinds of orders that can be made. So without limiting Section 237, the orders a court can make under that section include any of these following. Okay, sub A, an order declaring whole or part of any contract to be void. It can either be void ab initio or void after a certain date. An order varying the contract, or it may be varied on and after such particular date as the court thinks fit. An order refusing to enforce provisions, directing the payment of money, directing the respondent to pay the injured person, and this can be a third party, the amount of loss or damage, an order directing to repair or provide parts, directing the respondent to supply certain services, or where it's in relation to transferring an interest in land, to vary the instrument or terminate the instrument. So a nice little grab bag of examples there of the kinds of orders that can be made under Section 237. Now remember, it's without limitation to Section 237, which is extraordinarily broad and really does allow the court to tailor the kinds of remedies that might be required, quite particularly to the circumstances of a case. It's not limited by these examples at all. So that's the rather interesting orders that can be made under Section 237. And then we come down to a rather delightful division called Other Remedies. And here we have 246 non-punitive orders. Now, it specifically says non-punitive. However, some of these I feel a recipient of such orders may find a little punitive in nature so far as real world effect is concerned. But anyway, you have a read through and see what you think. Sub 1, the court may on the application of the regulator. So bear in mind these remedies are only available to the ACCC. Couldn't you have a field day with these otherwise? The ACCC may apply wherever there's been a breach of Chapter 2, so our old friend Section 18. Or there's your accessorial liability as well. The court can make the following orders to the person who's engaged in this conduct. So, an order directing the person to perform community service. How delightful. You've breached Section 18 and now you must do some kind of community service. What kind of community service is that? Well, an order of this kind may constitute things like requiring a person who's made naughty false representations to make a training video which explains advertising obligations under that schedule. An order requiring a person who is engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct in relation to a product to carry out a community awareness program to address the needs of consumers when purchasing the product. How delightful. Community service for breach of Section 18. Now, what else can you get under 246 sub 2? Well, subparagraph B really deals with naughty businesses and getting them to reform their naughty ways. So you can get an order that the person doesn't engage in the conduct, similar conduct, related conduct during the period of the order, and it can require them to establish a compliance program for employees in their business designed to ensure awareness of the responsibilities and obligations in relation to such conduct, directing the person to establish an education and training program for employees, an order directing the person to revise their otherwise slack or naughty internal operations that have allowed that breach to occur. So there's a fairly powerful little suite of provisions there to give a fairly strong nudge to errant corporations, errant businesses that might be breaching these provisions here. Look at this, subparagraph C. You can order disclosure of information that's required. Okay. You can require the person to publish at their expense and however specified an advertisement in the terms specified or determined in accordance with the order. This provision is the corrective advertising provision, and it's a very useful little provision where, for example, Coles Bakery got done a couple of years ago for making some misleading or deceptive comments in advertisements. It was required to publish corrective advertisements there. I've given some more details on this particular provision because it's quite useful in our tutorial work on this topic. So they are the rather delightful other remedies you can get in Division 5. And they are the main suite of remedies that you'll get under the ACL. Like I always say, if you have any queries or questions, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, post up something on Facebook, and I'm sure we'll clear it up. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in a Zoom tutorial sometime soon. And that's it for now. Thanks, guys.